Kia ora, everybody. We'll just wait for a few more people to join us. Takes a few moments. Kia ora, everybody. We'll make a start. We've got a few people just joining us. Sometimes it can take a minute or two as people flood into the webinar. My name's Kate Wright from the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum. And with me, I have Dr Hillary Bennett from Leading Safety, and I'll introduce Hillary shortly. I just wanted to talk briefly about today's session. As you'll know, as you've come in, you'll probably notice we're in a webinar, not a Zoom call. That's just due to the sheer interest we had in the session. So we felt this was a bit more of a productive way to run it. And you'll also notice that there's a chat and Q&A function at the bottom. Please use the chat function if you can when you have questions. And what I'll do is I'll keep an eye on it throughout. And when Hillary has sort of moments or slight breaks, I'll ask her some of the questions that are posed in there. And thank you very much to those people who did send in questions ahead of today's session. We will be answering those near the end of the session, so they'll definitely be addressed. And obviously you're all here for this discussion around mental wellbeing indicators and interventions. And of course, as a result of the Forum and Leading Safety's two latest resources on these topics. And the interest has been wonderful. And I think it's indicative of how many people are looking at actually what's working and how to measure it really well. And we've had, as the forum has had demand for some of these answers to some of these questions for sort of 9 to 12 months. And so we've been really delighted that we've been able to engage Dr. Hillary Bennett to help us produce these two resources. So a huge thank you to her. And just, I guess, a point really to make in that while these resources are here to help you, you might find that for some of you, they can help you, support you with a suite of measurements and ideas of effective interventions. Others might use bits and pieces of it, and so really we're not here saying this is it, but hopefully it starts a conversation, and for some of you it might be really, really useful. And so we'll go through all of those two resources shortly. But before we start, I've just got a really quick poll which I'm just going to pop up, and that's just going to ask you around how you're currently measuring wellbeing in your organisation. So that might be you're not, and that's totally fine too. So if you just have a moment or two to pop an answer into that poll, and we'll be able to share them shortly. So thank you for doing that. And while you're answering that, I will just introduce Dr. Hillary Bennett. So for many of you, she will need no introduction. You've possibly worked with her in your organisation or seen her through Forum or other work that she's done. And so at the Forum, we've been really lucky to work with her alongside her for a number of years, and her partner, Dr. Philip Voss at Leading Safety. So I'm going to hand over to her shortly. I'll just give you another 10 seconds or so to answer that question. We've got about half responses, so that should be something really good to go on, and I'll end that. And I'm going to try and share the results, but you'll have to bear with me. Can anyone see that? Can you see that, Hillary?
No.
Possibly not. Okay,
and
Hillary and I'll have a look at that. I'll have a look while Hillary's talking, and we can discuss that perhaps throughout if we need to. But look, I'll hand over now to Hillary, and as I said, please pop questions in the chat. We will be finishing this session at 3 o'clock, and also you might note it's been recorded, so if you have people in your organisation who want to watch it after, you'll be able to have access to the recording from Monday when I send it out. Thanks, Hillary.
That's great. Thanks, Kate. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be with you. This is the third and fourth guide. They're sort of like one guide together in many ways that I've done for the forum. And to be honest, it's probably been the most challenging one. Although I have huge confidence in the mental wellbeing by framework that we developed, and I am very comfortable that we've got a good diagnostic tool. I'd like you to think of this as a start of our conversation around mental wellbeing indicators, and I'll share some of my thinking with you, but I'm not going to profess here to have saying I've got this area all cut and dry. So really, really invite all of us to keep learning and using my thinking as a starter for some of that. Well, it won't be a starter for many of you, I'm sure you've been doing it, but a continuation of our conversation in this space. Now, slides don't want to go down. Oh, sorry, Kate, my slides have just got stuck.
you want to just exit out of the full screen?
Okay, so as I said, two indicators, two guides coming through. One more focuses more on indicators, one more on the intervention. So I'm going to do the quickest of recaps around this, because these frameworks actually underlie all the work we've been doing around the forum, and therefore I've really tried to pull them back through into the indicators work as well. So as we all know, wellbeing is on a continuum. From thriving, going okay, to struggling and well. It's very universal in that, otherwise, every one of us has mental health in the same way as we have physical health every day. It's very subjective, it's dynamic, it moves very quickly, and it's holistic. And herein lies, again, some of the challenges in terms of creating some really good indicators to track our progress on this space. We also know that work is not always good for us. That sometimes it actually can be quite harmful, and sometimes we just survive it. But our goal and our aim is to try and create a situation where we actually really have healthy work, where people can actually thrive. And those of you who are familiar with the work from the forum will know that that's certainly a clear focus for the forum, is in terms of creating thriving workplaces. So the mental health framework from Guide 1, obligations and opportunities, mental health framework down the center of the diagram, 4 approaches to dealing with trying to meet our obligations and maximize our opportunities, protect space to identify the risks to people's mental health, identify the protective factors, and do good design work. The foster piece to build up people's capability to work in the space. The reclaim, when people are struggling, as we all do at some point at times, some of us more often than others, how we can maybe restore our well-being so that we can track more going back into the okay space. And of course, there are times when each one of us will require some level of medical or psychological support. So when it comes to measuring mental well-being, when I was given this challenge by the forum, I was sort of very the thinking around the mental health continuum, the thinking around those approaches is very informing some of my thinking as I was trying to make my way through this. And, you know, I was, in terms of putting these slides together, I was thinking, well, let's just go back to some basics here. What do we mean when we say measure? And if you go around and do some searches of what measurement is defined as, is to discover the exact size or amount of something. And if we say well-being is an individual's ongoing state which enables a person to thrive or not, herein lies the challenge. How do we get an exact measure of something that is subjective and dynamic? So again, I think it's a really important point for us to realize is that we tending, I think what I'm seeing in many workplaces is going to get some measurements of well-being that don't always actually acknowledge some of the facts that it's, particularly that it's dynamic. So when we go in and measure well-being in the same way as we might measure engagement, you know, people say, well, go measure our well-being. Well, if we take seriously that the fact that this is subjective and it is dynamic, then to measure it in August 2022 and think that's going to be what we have got a sense of going forward, it's not going to really work, because, you know, maybe September, October, it's really very different. And I mean, we've seen that through COVID, where things can make, you know, the external environment which we live in can change things quite drastically very quickly. So as we can't measure well-being directly, we have to use proxies or indicators to provide the assurance or confidence that the work is not mentally harming people and enabling them to thrive. So bear in mind, that's what we're using these indicators for. We're using these indicators to get the assurance that the work we're doing is having the effect that we hope we're getting. So where I landed when I was putting my head around this work was saying, actually, the chances are that we're never going to have a few set of indicators in this space, that we probably need a range of well-being indicators. So if we're going to be confident, you know, that the work doesn't result in mental harm and supports people to thrive, then we need a range of indicators, I think, across those 4 approaches to mental well-being at work. And so by default, we would have a range of indicators that would be tapping into the full range of the mental health continuum. So if I pause there, I suppose what I'm saying without saying it is that actually, when we go in and say, well, we want to measure well-being, and there are some good valid tools to go do that, then what we're saying is that as I said earlier, we're getting a point and call now. But what are we trying to do? Are we trying to measure where someone might be in that in terms of how many people are struggling in your workplace? Or are you trying to identify how many people are going okay, or how many people are thriving? So again, the measure you use, it gives me some indication, or gives us some indication, I think, of where you're paying attention to in terms of the mental health continuum. And we've always argued at the forum that that needs to be right across all 4 approaches. So what I try to do, and what's in the guide, is to say, okay, so what we want to do is we want to be able to get confidence that our interventions right across or all those 4 approaches are getting attention. And we don't want to go binary and sort of just use what we tend to use in the safety space is the language around lead and lag indicators. So what I am proposing is that there are a range of different types of indicators, and that you would want to have those indicators, or you could have those indicators or different indicators for design, for example, across protect, foster, reclaim, and support. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in a minute. But let's just go back to what I'm meaning by these type of indicators. So I think one of the things we could say as an indicator to give us confidence is, what is the design like of our interventions in terms of whether we go to assess or whether we're responding to people, whether it be in the foster or reclaim space with the intention of improving. So there's what I'm going to call a set of indicators that sit around the work we want to do around the design of our interventions. And then, of course, we then roll out these interventions. And so the next thing we want to say is, well, let's track the range, the range that we're not going too narrow, and that the effort we're putting in and accessibility of some of these interventions. And from the confidence level, the assurance level, what's really important is that we also have some measures around verification, because actually at the end of the day, no matter what we do, we really want to assess the effects and the impact of the intervention, regardless of which approach it sits in. Ideally, we also have some indicators that sit there and say, actually, so what have we learned from what we've done? And so how do we reflect on this work that we've been doing in the wellbeing space? And lastly, I'm thinking there's work we can do around anticipation, looking forward, predicting things that, we can have some future scenario-based type work and say what might be the wellbeing issues that are going to emerge for us over the next period of time, and how do we then feed that back into the design piece. So here's what I'm thinking is approaches to wellbeing. I've just taken the protect space. And so a design indicator there around the protect space would be, so we want to do the assessment of psychosocial risk, but you could think of, well, one approach would be to do the mental wellbeing by design. But as you know, some people are using things like bow ties, some people are using their engagement surveys. So the question here for us is, how good is our design? What evidence have we got that the approach we take in to identify psychosocial risks is effective, is appropriate? All right. So let's say we've now just landed on a place. We say, actually, we've done some assessment and measurement of what is good design around psychosocial risk assessment. So the next thing is we're going to roll this out. So to monitor, we might say, okay, well, the indicator here might be the number of work design changes made to eliminate or reduce psychosocial risks. So let's track. We're going to go and try and identify these risks. Let's track what it's the work design changes that we really want in, the number of work design changes that are actually happening as a result of that assessment process. And then the verification piece might be, well, okay, so how many of these psychosocial risks have we actually eliminated or minimized? Because that was our original, that's what our original objective was. And we also could be saying, and to what extent has that work that we've done to eliminate risks actually resulted in lower levels or higher levels of reported well-being, however we might measure that, and that's open to another conversation. And then we can review feedback from the mental design process, and we can then anticipate. And if you look at the diagram which sits in the guide, you can see that I think the design flows through to monitor, verify, learn, and anticipate. But all of those various indicators, we should be keeping an eye on to go back into the design piece. So in line with our thinking in the forum around mental wellbeing, and we've always seen this, or we've tended to see this as a design piece, not just an intervention. We need good design, whether it be redesign of work or the design of the interventions. And so we need to have, if we can get that up front really in place, then hopefully what falls out of that in terms of the things that we do might, if we monitor them and verify, learn, and anticipate, we'll be in a better space. So I suppose, as I always say, and many of you have heard me saying this many a times, is, if we go onto the balcony, try and take perspective. The question you might want to reflect on is, have wellbeing intervention, does your organization have wellbeing interventions across all 4 approaches? So if I go back in my slide here, I think you can look at identifying measures right across all 4 approaches. And are we using all 5 types of wellbeing indicators across all 4 approaches? Now, let me just pause here for a second. I think for many of us, what I'm proposing is going to be quite daunting. What you're looking for is maybe just a smaller suite of indicators. And so I'm not suggesting that this framework is something you're going to sign up for with, at 3 o'clock this afternoon. But I'm using it to get you to think broadly around what you are measuring. Because my concern at the moment is that what we see is people are measuring well-being by tucking a couple of questions into an engagement survey, as an example. And actually, what are we really measuring by doing that? So if we're saying we want to do really good design of mental well-being in the workplace, we know that these 4 approaches are really key. We know that the measurement, because it's well-being is subjective and dynamic, is challenging, that we need to maybe think differently around the sorts of measures we look at. So I'm hoping that this will give you some food for thought. The guide we've got are simply just indicators that we've worked with over the time. And to be honest, I'm not going to say I always got it absolutely right. I mean, some of you might look at that and say, actually, well, I think this should be sitting there. That's okay. It's more that I'm looking for breadth of coverage here. 4 approaches, not just using simple one-off indicators of well-being. I'm just monitoring my time because we've got things we need to do as we go through the afternoon. So these are some of the questions that you sent through to us. I'll just talk through those, and then Kate, you might have some other questions that have come through. The first question was, how do you make people feel comfortable to visually indicate they may be low on the mental health continuum spectrum? So really what this question is about is saying, how do we actually measure where people are landing on terms of that mental health continuum, on terms from thriving through to being unwell, and what might be some of the novel ways of doing that? And I have seen many organizations using simply the mental health continuum to get people to indicate either in toolbox meetings or, in a work huddle sort of environment, using the color coding as your way of saying, actually, I'm a bit orange today, or I'm a bit red. So I think the notion of using that color coding is a less threatening way of actually labeling myself as struggling. Just say I'm going in the orange today, or I'm actually a little bit red today, or I'm really green. So I think there is some interesting work to be done, but bear in mind what that question is focusing on is, where do I sit on the mental health continuum? So it's really measuring the impact of that well-being. Now, where that person sits on that mental health may be a result of their work, it may be a result of home, it will probably be a result of both. It's not giving us any indication of what have we done, or what's causing this person to land wherever they land. So let's bear in mind it is a measure of well-being, subjective well-being. When someone has a mental meltdown or breakdown, or how do you deem a person fit to work? Really interesting, challenging question. I don't know that I have got the answers to that, because I don't know that there just is a simple answer. I know that I've been asked this many times, and it's subjective and it's going to require dialogue. And I don't think there is not going to be a point at which you say, yes, now this person is ready, because it's going to vary from other people. What you need to wrap around that person is some good support to gradually return them to the workplace, and maybe to also support the team to have this person coming back into their workplace as well. What should you do when data is inclusive? So this is a lovely question. So between you're getting two sets of data and they're not necessarily talking or aligning to each other, I'm going to say be curious, and don't dismiss one with the other. I think what I would tend to personally focus on more is the anecdotal qualitative data. I think the story data has a much richness around it, but simply I think my response to that, is just to be really curious. The work design intervention of less mental wellbeing parent, I think this is a key issue, and I think it's an issue that we're going to pick up in our next bit of the conversation, which is actually what we have seen in New Zealand has been a real push to go towards individual, largely reactive wellbeing interventions. And what we are now requiring is people to shift and actually also think on where do we actually create some of the more work-related issues. So I'm going to leave that question a little bit unanswered, because I think we'll come back to it when we talk through the interventions. Right. Okay. So we're going to. Okay.
Yes, we don't have any questions as yet, but please feel free to pop them in the chat. Sorry, I hadn't realized that was disabled, but you're able to use it now. However, in the chat, we've just had a few comments, particularly around that first question about visually indicating where you might be on the continuum. So Louise has talked about their marketing team adopted the use of coloured dots on their phones as they started their team meetings with informal chats, which sounded really good. And someone else has talked about using Viva Insights, which asks that idea of the one question a day, how are you feeling, and tracks your responses each day.
Yeah. So great responses, guys. And I think there's something around that color coding that really does, it makes it really easy for us to land ourselves. And I think the fact that you're tracking it on a, pulse checking it is really fundamentally important, goes back to the real essence of our mental health, is that it is very dynamic. And so one of the key concerns I always have when people ask me, can you come and measure our well-being of our workplace? We say, well, I can measure it, but I can measure it and tell you what it's like now. If you're wanting to know where people are traveling in terms of their mental health, but that's no guarantee that's what it's going to look like in a couple of weeks' time. And so we have to be really cautious. And so whatever you think of putting into place, where you're going into that regular check-in, and then you can pick up the trends and you can pick up the patterns, and that's really, I think, much more helpful. Right.
Great. And I guess the other thing is, sorry for turning that poll off a bit earlier than I should have for some people, but I have posted the responses to that first question about how you're currently measuring mental wellbeing in your workplace in the chat. So just a very quick scroll of that, there's a couple of answers of not measuring it, but a lot of people using engagement surveys, wellbeing surveys, some talking also about having discussions and that, using that to measure them too.
Okay, can I just respond to the engagement survey? And this is just my personal opinion, so take it from where it comes. But I think we have to make a distinction between what we are trying to measure when we go into engagement survey. And I'm going to go way back in my career to when I was, heading up the business psych program at Massey for a period of time. And this was my bread and butter to teach engagement and organizational commitment and all those things. And engagement is around people giving, what we're trying to assess is their level of discretionary effort, the level at which they are organized, they're committed to the organization, and it's evolved over time. And so, yes, at one level, you could say, well, if someone's engaged and committed in work, maybe they find their work fulfilling, and yes, that will be good for their well-being. But at the other time, you have to be really careful, because actually those people are giving a lot of discretionary effort, are also probably the people that are burning themselves out in terms of putting so much effort into their work. So sometimes I think, your engagement survey is maybe better a measure of, could be in an unusual way, more of a measure of burnout than it is of engagement. So I just think what you need to think through in terms of what you're trying to measure. If you're trying to measure the drivers of well-being, then you need to go into that protect space, and you need to design, and this is a design piece, you need to have some good measures and sense of the design of the work you're doing around measuring the actual things that may impact on people's well-being. If you are wanting to measure the outcomes, then you can go into the mental health wellbeing space and do your color coding and your one-off questions around how am I traveling on the space. But I don't think it's helpful to just know how people are traveling if you don't have some sense of what might be some of the drivers of that. So, you want people to thrive. So you may want to measure, are they thriving or not? And but it's equally important to know what might be some of the drivers. And that leads us back into the intervention space as well, I think. Kate, are there any other questions?
Just another comment about basing our wellbeing framework on the forums framework and a scorecard of a number of indicators. And just saying after today, we'll go back and review that we've covered the 4 elements stated. It's a new area for organisations, and that's completely true. So, and it's a new area, I guess, in terms of the forum and Hillary in presenting this type of work. So, as Hillary said, we don't have all the answers necessarily. So we're learning alongside you.
But I do think, I mean, if you walk away from today thinking actually what we've got to develop some good measures, and actually, if we're really going to track our work out, if we want some really good measures of what well-being, the impact we're having on well-being, then I do really think we need measures that sit across all 4 approaches. But you may find that your work has been very individually focused, and so you may not have the data yet to even start measuring some of the protect space. Okay, Kate, is it time for us to move on to this one?
We've got one more question saying, how might you assess EAP data and trends?
Okay, so EAP data, if you put back into the forum framework, sits clearly in the support space, I think, because that's where someone's gone, put their hand up and said, actually, I need some form of support, whether it be psychological or medical support. So if you get in EAP data, you're getting lag indicators, you're getting indicators of people that have put their hands up. And all that's indicating to you is we have got a certain number of people that have indicated in terms of mental health continuum that they're sitting on the sort of struggling and unwell side of that, which is maybe helpful for you to understand, particularly if you're trending it, that whether you've got more people going to need that support than you usually would have, okay? But as always, and this has been a long-term issue with EAPs, I think, which is that because of the confidential nature of the process, which it needs to be, that you don't always get access to information around aspects of the work. And it may not be aspects of the work, I get that, it may be personal issues, but if there are aspects of the work, you don't get access to that information to be able to make some of the changes to that work. So it's a very individually based, very reactive intervention, and all it's going to give you is a measure of the number of people who are sitting at this point in time on the sort of struggling end of that mental health continuum, which, as I say, is a value in itself, but it doesn't really give you any sense of what else you need to do.
Great, thanks everyone, and thanks Hillary. I think that's the questions for now, but if they come to you, please just pop them in either the Q&A or chat, and we'll get to them in the next section.
Right, Kate, do you want me to talk to you? Shall I just keep going?
Yes, please. Thanks, Hillary.
So the other really interesting piece of this work that was quite daunting as well was because I naively went into the space, saying to Kate and Francois, at the forum, we really need to look at this intervention. And then when I put my head in, I thought, oh my goodness, this is really quite challenging. So I'm going to start off with just a reflection of, that using some Deloitte's work, that on the average return on investment, obviously is coming from the UK because it's in pounds, but on investment, they would argue is £5 for every £1 spent. But what they're arguing is, but what appears to be much less clear is the types of mental health interventions that workplaces should be looking to provide and how to and whom. And that's really where this conversation needs to start. I am not suggesting for one moment that actually all the work we're doing in the mental wellbeing space does not have a return in terms of supporting people doing. But what I am saying is that not all interventions are equal, and the evidence is starting to emerge around those that actually are having an impact, and those that sound and look like well-being, but actually don't necessarily always have the same the impact that we're looking for. So I suppose I'm starting off with just a cautionary note, okay? And that cautionary note comes from two large bits of work that I used. One which was a work coming out of the Policy Institute at the King's College in London, where they did a really considered piece of work looking at mental health interventions in the workplace. And it highlights quite strongly that the argument is there's a real lack of strong evidence for the effectiveness of workplace mental health interventions. And they argue it's largely due to the lack of high quality evaluation studies, but exacerbated by the fact that on the other hand, there's a lot of low quality evaluations that are claiming all sorts of things as really positive outcomes. So not enough really good evidence to say this really is making a difference, and yet a lot of inflationary claims around what is working for people. So cautionary note. And then also the Wellcome Workplace Mental Health Commission, a really good article, and I'll ask Kate to send this out to you after the webinar. A really nice review in terms of some workplace mental health, and again in a nice sort of evidence-based way. But their argument again is that it's not enough for employers to be investing in well-intended initiatives, that we actually need to start investing in the science to understand what actually works. So I think the appeal is to all of us that are working in this space is to say, when we go in, do we have some good measures of what we're actually doing? We can invest an awful lot of money in a whole lot of stuff, but if we haven't got good measures at the back end, how will we actually prove that what we're doing is actually having an impact? So those were two really insightful pieces of work to start off our thinking around that. And as I said earlier, wellbeing interventions in New Zealand are largely still sitting very much in the reactive individual intervention. So if you think of the framework, what I mean by reactive individual is sitting in the reclaim and the support space. So when people are really at that far end of that mental health continuum, we have EAPs and we have a whole host of stuff sitting in there. And we do a whole lot of mental activities like mental health days and pink shirt days and all sorts of things. And we have our frameworks, 5 ways to wellbeing, and the type of farm model, and a whole lot of stuff that is really good. And so we're doing a lot of work in what I would call, broadly speaking, self-care programs, mental first aid, mental wellbeing apps, resiliency building. Some of that work, to be honest, is not sitting in the reclaim space, would also be sitting as a capability piece. So we would put that into the foster space. And I think that we have gone to that space because those interventions have what I'm going to use a good psychological term, face validity. In other words, at face, they look like wellbeing work. They sound like it, they smell like it, and it makes us comfortable that what we're doing is really supporting people's well-being. There's an emerging amount of thinking that's saying actually that individual self-care focus can overestimate an individual's control over their lives and over their well-being, be it work or be at home, and underestimates the role of poorly designed work. And I think that's a really key thing for us to take into account when we say, well, we've only got limited resources. What are we going to do to get people sitting on that thriving end of the continuum? If we keep going back to the individual reactive self-care focused type interventions, we will not get long-term sustainable change. In fact, there is an argument that you actually doing some people a disservice because you're actually encouraging them to stay in what I'm going to call their comfort of their discomfort zone, because they are doing good self-care and they're sort of managing to survive what is less than good work. So that's a cynical view for the day. So, you know, but I do think that is a really good call, that we underestimate the role of poorly designed work when we focus too strongly on individual self-care interventions. However, not all interventions are equal. We know that. So there is evidence, thank goodness, of the effectiveness of, although the evidence of the effectiveness of those individual focus is mixed and at times confusing, the effectiveness of their work-focused interventions is much stronger. So if you look at the research that's been done around when we go and actually look at the work and try and modify the work, the impact on well-being, the evidence there is stronger. And what we've seen is these interventions are having the most impact on people's well-being. And I'm sure there are other things, but these are the ones that sort of bubble up as the key ones. So when we design the work, so there's greater worker inclusion in decision-making, particularly around decision-making that affects their day-to-day work. When we have flexible work, and we've learned that through COVID, but we've also learned that flexible work in and of itself has its own challenges. And we also learned that what flexible work doesn't simply mean is just the hours that you work, and there's a range of stuff the forum's done in that space. One of the key impacts on people's well-being that we can influence in terms of the workplace intervention is giving people more autonomy. So the first one is more inclusion in decision making. This is more around having some control over the way I do work, and the language that's emerging there is around job crafting, where actually I can, as an individual, have some say in terms of how this work is done, what I'm going to do, what I'm not going to do as well. Budding at onboarding or inductions is really quite interesting, isn't it? So there's some research that's quite showing a really positive impact on people's well-being when you bring people in, budding them up, because what you're doing there is actually immediately giving them a sense of social connection, a sense of somewhere to go if I'm a little bit unsure about something. And so you're helping them, you're actually increasing psychological safety. And if that budding up process is done from a perspective of respect and dignity, which, you know, is one of the cornerstones of psychological safety, is that the very cornerstone, the very foundations of psychological safety, is my last bullet point as well, is that I feel accepted for who I am, regardless of who I am. And then I will feel comfortable to start questioning, then I'll feel comfortable to start contributing, and then I feel comfortable to start challenging. So psychological safety, not a binary thing. So, you know, that budding helps that connection piece, which we know is really important in terms of our mental health. Organizational justice. So organizations that have really designed the work and really actually push to create a culture where there is a real sense of fairness and that I'm treated fairly and I'm treated equally, that has a significant impact on people's well-being. And then a slightly one that's slightly different, but strong evidence to say on that when you actually look at the way we do our work, sitting at our desks, and if we're breaking up excessive sitting, has a really powerful impact on anxiety and depression as well. So there's just some examples, folks. There's lots more out there. One of the things that we landed at the forum is saying is actually, this is a guide that we're probably going to need to update as we keep our heads above the water and get our sense of where this information is going. So just as a starter, let's just say not all interventions are equal. Workplace interventions seem to have more stronger evidence at the moment. Here are some examples of what those might be. However, there are effective individual focused interventions as well. You know, I don't want you to walk away from me. I think, you know, it's just the work stuff. Yes, there is stuff that we can do at an individual level that is showing some impact. I think it's really interesting, some New Zealand research working on the impact of people who use the New Zealand Health Foundation's 5 ways to wellbeing practices has shown that all of those practices, if they're woven into people's lives, we weave them into their lives, or if an organization gives an opportunity to put those practices into place, like volunteering in, you know, activities for people to connect, activities for people to keep learning new things, all those 5 ways to wellbeing practices, that all of them on their own has an impact, positive impact on people's mental health. But what is really powerful is the combination of the take notice and the keep learning ones. So when people feel that they are experiencing new things, they're not stuck in a rut, they're open to new experiences, they're getting opportunities to learn new things, and they're also being mindful around they're doing it, those two together have a particularly strong impact on people's well-being. There is also evidence that I would say of a range of the very individual, sort of more therapeutic-based type interventions, that mindful-based interventions are powerful. Now, don't forget, the take notice well-being practice is all based around mindfulness. It's based on the evidence that when people practice mindfulness and are good at mindful and are skilled at being mindful, that has an impact. So there's a bit of triangulation in those two pieces. Now, here's a surprise, I think. Well, not a surprise when you really think about it, but it did take me by surprise when I first read it, which is actually one of the most effective well-being interventions in terms of impacting on where people sit on that mental health continuum is financial literacy. So when an organization goes in to help people manage their finances a little bit better, then that really has a significant impact. And so when you think about it, that makes sense, doesn't it? You know, we all have challenges in terms of making ends meet. And so when we actually help people to do that, it's a workplace sport intervention that is. So it's individually based intervention that does not sound like well-being, doesn't look like well-being, but actually has a significant impact on well-being. And then there's another bit of research that says when you go for your individually based interventions, if you can get an intervention that is a combination of both a physically based intervention and a mental health based intervention, that combination is more powerful than one on its own, each one on its own. So some evidence saying that when you, so what could this look like? This could look like you sponsoring a physical activity, or, let's say like a fun run or something, or, you know, a physical activity like going out and planting trees, but you link it in with a strong connection piece, a strong piece around maybe this is something new we've never done, maybe this is about volunteering and giving into our community. So you're starting to get these things woven in together, which again would sort of, as my language has indicated, take me back quite strongly to the value of the 5 ways to wellbeing practices. Now, if I go to really strongly psychologically based interventions, the evidence is saying quite clearly again that cognitive behavioral therapy, which we've known for a long time is really impactful in terms of helping people with depression, that so cognitive based type interventions or based interventions for your people that may be sitting on that struggling, unwell end of the continuum would be really helpful as well as a therapeutic approach. So that's where I was going to share with some of the thinking I'm sharing with you. In the guide, you'll read some more detail and data around some of those interventions. As I mentioned, we can send out the article around putting the science back into wellbeing, because it's got some really nice little ideas sitting in there that I haven't had the time to reflect with you. But what I'm going to do is hand it back to Kate, because she's got another poll that she wants to do.
Yes, I do, Hillary. But before we do, there's 2 questions in here for you, if that's okay. The first one is about or someone's just saying, good point about the idea of looking good to have a high number of interventions. What advice would you give organisations who wish to address protective, sustainable, long-term interventions that would involve robust evaluation plans?
What advice? I would say do some good diagnostic work around identifying what are the specific psychosocial hazards for different types of work in your organisation, and then this is and then big and then carve out sufficient time to really think through what the remedial action might be. In other words, what might you do to change or modify the work? Because I think, and I think Kate and I have experienced this with the work that we've been doing around the mental mind design, is that very often people identify those things, but shortchange and think that the solutions will be just readily available. It's really the solutions that will, for sustainable change, you need the second end of the mental wellbeing by design process is probably what you need to focus on. And that's going to require you to get your leaders to understand the commitment that is required. It's going to get people to be able to sit around. You might need to get some subject matters expert, because workers might be able to identify what's causing their well-being to be impacted by the work, but they may not always have the ideas around what might be solutions. Of course, they are the subject matter experts around their work, so they will have some good solutions, but they may not need, they may need some help to maybe identify some more evidence-based type things. So sorry, a little bit of a ramble on answering that question, but really sustainable change requires us understanding what good work redesign looks like, rather than just identifying what might be the drivers of poor mental health.
Thanks, Hillary. Second question, and often one that we've had before. How do you get the exec level who make the changes on board with the protect space changes around how the work is designed?
Yes,
when they're so much more versed with having remedial reactive interventions rather than an overhaul on the way people work in an organization?
Yeah, so really, yeah, really good question. And I think I would suggest we go back. I'm going to go back a slide here. No, I'm going to go back to this slide. I think what we need is evidence. We need evidence of what's working. And the evidence is that actually the work-related interventions are having more impact on people's mental health than the broad ad hoc range of individual-based interventions that we tend to go for in a very haphazard way, and also not very often in a sustainable way, in the sense that what you see, and I see what you see, I'm sure, is this year we're doing this and the next year we're doing that. So I mean, if we're going to go for individual interventions, then we've got to make sure that those things are there all the time, and it's not just seen as a, as a silver bullet. So to go back to your question, I wonder whether, and I don't necessarily have all the answers to that, but I wonder whether what we need to do is actually continue doing this bit of work and say, okay, what does the evidence tell us about what is working? So that when you go to your execs, you can say, look, we could invest in some resiliency training for all our people, and it will cost us X, Y, Z. Or we could invest in really exploring what flexibility might look like and how it would work. Or we could really explore this notion of getting people to come into our organizations and really connect them well, and do that onboarding stuff well, so that we're giving them some better sense of what the options might look like in terms of what might have impact. So that's just a thought for a Friday afternoon.
The next question from Jennifer: for individual focused interventions, how often would these need to be implemented to be effective?
Oh, I don't know that I can answer that question, because it really would depend, I suspect, on your individual intervention. What I see, though, let's just take an individual. This would be an individual intervention that is very common across New Zealand, where we would invite guest speakers to share their stories around their own mental health travels, which are very powerful, and they normalize the conversation around mental health. But I would question whether they actually have the long-term impact, because it's a one-off, and there's a great amount of information and there's a great interest around it, and certainly it would normalize it. So to answer your question, I think that any individual intervention has to be embedded as part of a wellbeing program rather than seen as a one-off. So when I do the wellbeing mapping process, where I go into an organization and look what they've currently got in place, I see a range of things from that are really individual interventions, one-off in the reclaimed space, that aren't building long-term capability and sustainability. So hard to answer your question. It really depends on what individual intervention it is. But if you want long-term sustainability, your individual interventions really should be in the foster space about building capability, I think.
Next question: how do we feel, this could be for the wider group too, but also possibly for you, Hillary, how do we feel by outsourcing a mental health and wellbeing program to organizations that specialize in this area? This is a highly skilled area of knowledge requirement.
Gosh, unprocessed thinking response, I wouldn't outsource it at all, because I think you need to understand the context in which the work is done. And I think that when you outsource it, well, let me restart that. If you understand, if you buy into what I'm saying, which is actually our workers across the whole mental health continuum, absolutely, you may want to outsource the work that sits at the extreme end of that, around the people who are really struggling unwell. Never had an issue with you outsourcing. We're not counselors, and we're not, most, the people that are in your workplace aren't counselors, so that work should go out. But we shouldn't be outsourcing, I don't think, the work that is around how do we thrive, how do we design the work better. So just depends on what you're outsourcing and where on the mental health continuum saying. So if you're outsourcing the work where people are now psychologically, psychiatrically, they've got an issue, that then it's depression, it's anxiety, whatever it might issue, bring in the experts on that. The bulk of that mental health continuum, though, doesn't require experts in terms of well-being. It requires people who are genuinely keen and wanting to understand how they can design work so that people can thrive. And there's no one better to do that work than the people in the workplace. So I wouldn't outsource that at all.
Thanks, Hillary. I see Tina has got her hand up. I'm going to try and let you talk, Tina. I'm not sure if you can. You're on mute. Do you have something you wanted to ask, Hillary?
No. Oh, Tina wanted to ask me.
Yes, sir.
Apologies. Clicked the wrong button.
Oh, good. No problem. Thanks, Tina.
Hi, Tina. Hi.
Look, again, we've still got a few minutes left, so please pop some questions in if they come to you. As Hillary said, we just wanted to do another quick poll, which I'll leave this open for a little longer this time. Just asking you really what had surprised you most about some of that research around the effectiveness of some of the interventions. Bearing in mind this is very fluid and changing sort of monthly, really. There's more and more evidence and research coming to light, and that's why that effectiveness guide that the forum's put out is only a digital version. That's something that we've committed to updating regularly, so possibly every sort of 6 months we'll be putting out a new version of that, or when new evidence comes to light, because there, as Hillary has said, it's sort of a very emerging area, and it's sort of particularly in some of those interventions, it's quite mixed reviews of the effectiveness. So look, I'll leave that open. Well, Hillary, do you want to talk to your last slide?
Yeah, sure. And just as a comment following on what Kate was saying, I think if you go back to these two pieces of work, really are go hand in hand, because one of the things which that putting the science back sort of argument is that I think we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our, all of us, to actually say, when we have an intervention that is working, in other words, we've done good verification. We're not just monitoring the number of people participating in an EAP or the amount of people participating in whatever the intervention might be. We're actually tracking, we're having an impact. We actually are reducing the psychosocial risk. So we're actually increasing people's well-being by the work we do. So I think that verification piece around those indicators is fundamentally important, and we haven't done that good work. And so, we're a community all working together, and I would really encourage any of you, if you've done something and you have measured it, no matter how you've measured it, if you've measured it and you can say, actually, here's some evidence, we would love to hear it, because, as Dave's saying, if we're going to go digital with this, we can keep updating it. I think that work that Massey did, some researchers did at Massey around the 5 ways to wellbeing is a gem, because it's telling us that here are things that you can do, and the evidence tells us right here in New Zealand that this stuff actually makes a difference. So I would really encourage you to do that verification piece and actually keep us informed, so we can actually share the good news. I don't think I can go. Oh, yes, I can. So the poll is there. I'll turn that off. So just as some closing comments, I suppose the position I'm taking, and I've probably been quite more forceful to this afternoon than maybe I normally am, but I really do think that to sustain long-term well-being, and I think that's the key thing here. This is not about just intervening, getting a little bit of an improvement, and then it drops off. So if we really want to sustain long-term well-being, it does require courage to examine the work, not just toughen up and fix the people. Now, I know that all of you on the call today, and all the individual intervention work. I'm not devaluing that, and I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying it's now time for us to do more than that. So, you know, the position I'm taking quite strongly here is that without the conditions that enable workers to thrive, individually focused interventions will inevitably fall short. We won't get that long-term sustainable change that we want. So self-care is absolutely necessary. I have no argument with any of the interventions that we do to help people care for themselves. In fact, there is some very interesting work coming through around collective self-care and saying actually it's not just about helping people to look after themselves, but actually that in a workplace, the opportunity to look after each other and do collective self-care is a very powerful approach as well. So, you know, but self-care is necessary, but it's not sufficient to build a workplace where people can thrive. And so, you know, I think we really do need to, and here's where I'm going to go back to pulling these things together. We need indicators around how we're doing in the protect space, as well as we got indicators in terms of how people are traveling in the support space, which is what most people are doing, is measuring their EAP you know, uptake. Let's start doing better work across the other approaches in terms of the indicators. And I think that might be my last slide, Kate. So, so folks, from my side, I just want to say again, you know, thank you for the opportunity. Well, thanks the forum for the opportunity for me to do this work. I hope you find it helpful. I hope I haven't made it too daunting for you. And I'm not suggesting that all the indicators I've got in the guide I'm never ever suggesting you need to have that full range. I mean, it's just there as a starter for you to start thinking these are the sorts of things you could be trying to pull in. But what I am saying is, if you are focusing your work right across the mental health continuum, then you really need to have measures that go right across the mental health continuum, and you need to have interventions that are evidence-based, that are not just individually based, but also work-based. So that's sort of the key sort of message from me this afternoon. So thanks very much for your time. Thanks to Kate for organizing, getting us all together. And as always, I'm on the other side of a call or an email if you've got any questions. So I'll hand it back to Kate.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Hillary. Really appreciate your time. Hillary is an extremely busy schedule, so we were very lucky to find this hour today. I think otherwise we were going to have to wait till October. So we really appreciate her taking that time. Just before you go, just to signal a couple of upcoming resources and things happening in this area from the forum. And the first thing I'd say is around the redesign of work. We're quite conscious that, you know, we've heavily promoted the mental wellbeing by design process, the diagnostic process, which is a fantastic, well, in our belief, way of really looking at what your mental wellbeing risks are. However, often some people have got to the end of that and said, okay, well, here is what it's found, and what next? And so we've engaged a woman called Renee Jane, who runs Thrive Labs, to do some work with 3 organisations looking at their key issues and how they could look to redesign the work. At the end of that, there'll be a sort of a guide, not around specific interventions, but more around the process you could take to design or redesign work and design some solutions. So we're hoping that would be available early next year, once she's finished that work with those 3 organisations. For the CEOs on the call today, Leading Safety, so Hillary's organisation and the forum have just started a new mental wellbeing course for CEOs called Be Well to Lead Well. This is about understanding and your own wellbeing to then enabling you to lead wellbeing in your organisation. You can find some more information on that on the website. Please feel free to email Hillary or I about it, and you can actually register for the next course, which is in October for that. In terms of the diagnostic process, that mental wellbeing by design process, we are trialling a digital solution for that at the moment, which is really exciting. So again, if that's something you'd be interested in and the outcomes of that, please get in touch. And finally, also for the CEOs on the call, there is a CEO connection call, the forum CEO connection call with Francois on this very topic, as well as sort of exploring flexible working and the challenges and opportunities presented there, and that's on the 30th of August at 10 a.m, and you can register on our website for that. So I think that's all. It feels like daily notices. But look, thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Great to see so much interest in this. Please share if you've learned something. We would just love to hear it and include it in our effectiveness piece.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have a great weekend, and I'll send around this recording, the slides, and the article Hillary mentioned on Monday for you all.
Great. Thank
everyone.
you. Take care, everyone. Have a lovely weekend. Bye.
Bye.